Good evening, I'm Stephen Cummings, and welcome again to another edition of the Citizens Community Forum. And as per usual, our objective is always to have an engaging, interactive, and a civil discourse, and in so doing, help the Good evening, I'm Stephen Cummings, and welcome again to another edition of the Citizens Community Forum. And as per usual, our objective is always to have an engaging, interactive, and a civil discourse, and in so doing, help develop a culture of peace and understanding. Good evening, I'm Stephen Cummings, and welcome again to another edition of the Citizens Community Forum. And as per usual, an engaging, interactive, and a civil discourse, and in so doing, help develop a culture of peace and understanding through constructive dialogue and Good evening, I'm Stephen Cummings, and welcome again to another edition of the Citizens Community Forum. And as per usual, our objective is always to have an engaging, interactive, and a civil discourse, and in so doing, help develop a culture of peace and understanding through constructive dialogue and, yes, citizens' participation. Our guests are persons who express views, opinions, and perspectives of their own, and sometimes may not necessarily be that of the FBN network, the Citizens Community Forum, or that of the host. And as per usual as well, our topics are also wide-ranging. Discussions at times may be emotionally charged, but surely we can always find common ground and learn from each other, irrespective of our differing views. Now, within the last several days, one of the national conversations has been on the cost of university education in Trinidad and Tobago. And what was revealed by the state, by the government, was that it would not be able to help support the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, financially based on any further request for an increase in funding, unless it engages in a 10% cut in expenditure. A proposal was sent to the government for an increase in its budgetary allocation, to which the government rejected, saying it had to weigh other competing demands for funds, and especially in a period of reduced national revenue. So The UWI was asked to cut its expenditure by 10%, and the recommendation came as a shock to some, while others knew some structural adjustment was coming or had to be made. Now, what we have also heard is that GATE, which is the Government Assistance for Tuition Expenses Program, had a major impact on driving up expenditure. There are several questions that must be answered. Should GATE be blamed for the UWI's financial troubles? Was the gate left too widely open? Was there a poor management system in place that allowed for the UWI to grow into this education service monster that it no longer is able to sustain itself financially on the basis of a continuous expansion of courses? Because we did hear from the Minister of Finance, Cummings, that the institution had been expanding in terms of its courses and its facilities, so that obviously that would have attracted additional funding. How can we tame this, which we have created? Is a budget cut really the solution? Is there now a greater role, for example, for the private sector or private sector investors, to step in support of higher education? And these are some of the questions we want to address this evening inside the Citizens Community Forum. And I have with me for yet another time, this time former government minister, former education minister, Dr. Tim Gopi-Singh, who has been in this area for many, many years, the area of education, not just as a medical professional, but also one who understands the system of education, being a former education minister himself. Dr. Gopi-Singh, good evening to you and welcome to the Citizens Community Forum.
Good evening, Mr. Cummings, and good evening to your viewers and to your listeners. It's a privilege and a pleasure, and I consider it an honor to speak with you on such an important issue that you're raising here this evening in the Citizens Community Forum through your various links, etc.
Yes,
thank you for asking me. I'm honored to be on your program.
And thank you again, Dr. Gopi-Singh. I know the last time that you were on our program, we were, on a different subject matter, but albeit, we are talking education, and being a former Minister of Education, we thought it was, important to have you in as well, so that you can give us your perspectives. We have been hearing a lot from the government on this, budgetary cuts for university education, and it has come as quite a surprise to some who I suppose were not expecting or were hearing it for the very first time. I understand also that the Students' Guild has been also expressing concerns about whether there would be an increase in fees come maybe next academic year. But we want to address a couple of questions which we hope you can walk us through. Again, I raised the question of the GATE program, Dr. Gopi-Singh, and in a previous incarnation, you probably would have had a sort of closer look at this initiative. Should GATE be blamed for the financial troubles of the UWI?
But Stephen, may I be privileged to take you through a quick process of the expenditure on education,
sure,
internationally and nationally? Most developed countries have utilized about 6% of their gross domestic product on education. And Trinidad and Tobago, when we were in government, Mrs. Bissessa's team, we came close to utilizing about 6% of the annual gross domestic product on education. So we had the largest budget on education because we believed, and she believed, that human capital development was the way to go to develop your country with the brain power that is needed for development.
Yes.
So we spent almost 16% of our annual budget. Our budget then used to be about 55%. So 1/6 of that used to be around $8.5 to $9 billion. So we spent about $8.5 to $9 billion both. And for the 5 years, Mrs. Bissessa determined that education will get the largest amount on the national budget. So that was divided into early childhood education, primary school, secondary school, and then tertiary education. Minister Karim was the head of the tertiary education sector. I was the head from the early childhood to primary to secondary education. So we divided the funds. Also, tech work education became an important part of it. So we utilized close to about 6% of the GDP, equaling developed countries, and about 16% of our GDP. Unfortunately, this government, from the ab initio, from the 7 years ago when they came into office, began to downplay the role of education and began to cut on the education sector from the beginning. And they had where we had two ministers of education managing the education sector, they decided to have one. It is a massive problem to manage the education program up to secondary school,
Yes.
and then the tertiary education. Now, tertiary education,
university, yes.
Yeah, tertiary education goes into UWI, COSTAT, UTT, and then a number of private tertiary institutions that were training people in various areas. Don't forget the private tertiary education where GATE was the funding for it. Yeah. In addition, you have tech work education as well. So the budget had to be shared amongst all these contenders for the budget. And in addition, you had to have the infrastructure development program with the IDF. So let me just give you a little idea of how the 6.5 billion was spent.
Sure. And when you do that, Dr. Gopi Singh, we're going to come back to the GATE program. But
yes, sure.
Yes.
Sure. So I'm giving you a broad picture because that's how I manage the Ministry of Education.
Okay.
You can't go as a Minister of Education and go helter-skelter without knowing the broader picture. So we had about 14,000 teachers in the system, about 7,000 equally for both primary school and secondary school. And they constituted a budget close to about $3 billion out of the $6-point-something billion for education. Then you had, so I will come to the tertiary education part pretty shortly. Then you had about $250 million being spent on security for schools, about $250 million spent for a school feeding program, another $40 million spent for school transportation system. Then you had to pay medical school social workers and a number of areas. And then the infrastructure development fund for constructing schools and for repairing schools that had an annual budget of about $450 million. So, and then you have to have the denominational boards, which are about, in the secondary school system, you had about 85 secondary schools under the denominational boards out of the 125. They had more schools than the government. And then you had to have the primary schools, 340 something out of the 425 primary schools. So when you give the allocation of funding to these primary schools and the secondary schools out of the 6.5 billion and paid for national security, paid for school feeding program, paid for the teachers and so on, and the ancillary staff, most of the budget is crumpled right there. Now for tertiary education, Minister Karen probably would have received about $2 billion. Now, the University of the West Indies used to get about 600 million out of that.
Okay.
And then
that's annually. That's annually, is it?
Annually. Then the GATE program received another 600 million, but that was split between a number of tertiary educations like Roy Tech, UTT, COSTAT, and the other private tertiary education centers that were providing tertiary education. Now, the University of the West Indies has found themselves in trouble. And I was a university professor. I mean, I was associate professor from 1993 to 2007, 14 years, and I was clinical dean of the medical school. But let me just take you back just for 1 minute. When the NAR came into office in 1986, Eric Williams Medical Sciences Complex had just been finished being built by the Soditeg construction company, which was supposed to cost $500 million, that ended up costing about $1.2 billion. It was a white elephant. So NAR came to the medical faculty of the University of the West Indies. I wasn't clinical dean then, but I was a younger member of the medical faculty. And they told us to get Mount Hope going, you have to be self-sufficient. We decided, Professor Melville, who, God bless his soul, he is now deceased, he was at the CARICOM head desk, he came back and produced what you call a red book to show that if we bring students from Manipal University, we would be providing in a few years, we'll be self-sufficient. So we charged $12,000 US per medical student for 49% of the admissions to the medical faculty in 1987 when we opened the medical school. In 4 years, we were self-sufficient and we began to make a profit.
Okay.
And when I was clinical dean of the medical school in 94 to 97, we were about 20-something million dollars in the black. So it means that the university has the capacity and the capability to develop their own funding.
Yes.
And where is the university sitting on their hands, not being able to generate funding for themselves, but relying on the state and the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago to continue providing money for them to spend, without they developing systems where they can get those people around the world to provide by philanthropy some money for them, where people who have benefited from the program, past students and so on, can donate money to help in research and development.
Yes.
Now, there are a number of international institutions on education which provide funding for research and development. I can't tell you the last day that the university has been able to tap into that funding so that they can continue to develop their research and development. Because we have a paucity of research within the university that does not meet the international criteria for loans. So the university has been sitting back, depending on the state, when they could, just a simple thing of the offshore medical school. We have been talking, Dr. Rowley's government has been talking about this for 7 years. Where is the offshore medical school? Barbados has 5 offshore medical schools under the program there now for clinical studies and so on. All the other Caribbean islands have offshore medical schools. We have a sitting place in Tobago. We have
where nothing is happening. You see nothing is happening.
In Trinidad where we can be training students from abroad. What have we done about that?
Well, I know there's been a discussion to Dr. Gopi Singh about medical tourism, but that's another subject matter that we can probably address some other time.
It's a separate issue from that.
Yes.
But we have to develop the systems and the competence and the capacity and the capability to have a proper program in Trinidad where we can get patients from around the world and invite top surgeons to come and do the surgery. But the St. George's Grenada has blossomed as a result of the offshore medical school. When I was at UWI as one of the associate professors, University of the West Indies never wanted to grant the recognition to St. George's University because UWI thought that St. George's was inferior to the standard that we had set.
Right.
Now, St. George's University has come and overtaken UWI in terms of international recognition. And where are we? Because we have been sitting down, we have lacked the brain power and the capacity and the capability and the intelligence to move forward, create an offshore medical school, get some funding internationally from benefactors, use some philanthropy, get some funding for research and development. But the university has sat down all along. So this is why the government finds itself in trouble to continue to give the $600 million for university. So it has to be looked at in the context of the wider picture.
Right.
What you're doing with the funding.
Right, because what I'm getting.
One more point. I remember when we were the medical faculty, I was clinical dean when we had about 98 members of staff at the time. We stopped the travel of professors and senior lecturers because they would want to use the university funds to travel and to go to international medical conference and pay per diem to them. So we stopped that. And that is how we were able to cut down on the expenditure. I don't know whether that is still happening at the University of the West Indies. Okay. So an expenditure analysis need to be carefully done as quickly as possible, determine where the University of the West Indies can reduce their expenditure, determine where they can increase their funding, and do the necessary things to increase their funding so that they become much more self-sufficient. So this thing about the University of the West Indies saying that they can't make do on a cut from 600 to 400 million, I beg to differ from that. You need to analyze where you're going, what you have been doing, and make sure that you can work within the constraints.
Well, the request from the government is that they should be looking at a 10% cut in expenditure. But certainly, what you're saying, Dr. Gopi Singh, is that the University of the West Indies has the capacity to generate its own funding, or at least part funding. Is that what I'm getting from you?
Yes, Stephen, thank you very kindly. You have put it in a precise language, and they have not been doing that. If they have been doing that, it is to a minuscule extent. And then they need the GATE program. We come back to that because there was some overlapping of some of the programs between one institution and another, and students were moving. After they failed one program, they move on to another program. They were doing 2 sets of programs at the time. When Mr. Karim was there, he began, and Mrs. Bissa's cabinet did a proper analysis of that, and we put into place measures to stem the tide of abuse.
All right,
and so
Dr.
we were able to cut down.
Dr. Gopi, let me just interject here before we continue. I want you to develop a little more on that that issue of the GATE program. But we just want to remind our listeners that this is the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings. I'm talking with former Education Minister Dr. Tim Gopi Singh, and our topic this evening: reactions to university education budget cut. And of course, we have been hearing quite a lot which has also made the national conversation within the last few days. And we are talking about this issue, an important issue when we talk about education. It has to do with the development of the human capital. And there's so many other things that are connected to education. So very, very important topic this evening. Dr. Gopi Singh, you were talking about the GATE program. I'll allow you to develop further on that.
Yes, the GATE program. When we came into office, we realized that there was some overlapping in the programs, and we needed to rationalize the amount of programs. We needed to rationalize the private service providers. We needed to rationalize all the tertiary educations that the state was helping, like Roytech, UTT, CoStat, and so on. And then, of course, University of the West Indies.
Yes.
And so Minister Karim and Mrs. Bissessa, as the helm of the government, and those of us inside cabinet, assisted in the careful analysis, and we began to streamline down the expenditure on the GATE program.
Okay.
But permit me, so it was moving in the right direction. But I have been in politics for 28 years of my life. And I'm not as active as I used to be. I'm now an advisor to the party. Whatever way the party may.
As you mentioned politics, Dr. Gopi Singh, this is not a political platform. It's not a political. Sure. But I'm saying that is it that we have been making too much politics out of education, and I'm not pointing at any particular individual or any particular administration. Has education become too politicized? Where we also have these problems. Yes, the university there's a shortfall. There's need for funding. Has that been part of the problem as well, Dr. Gopi Singh?
Well, we made significant gains in 2010 to 2015 in the education sector. I think during Mrs. Bissessa's term of 2010 to 2015, I think it's unquestionable that the performance of the People's Partnership government in education has been exceedingly phenomenal. And if I am to relate to you the gains that we made, well, of course, a laptop program, the change of the primary and early childhood education curriculum, the performance had been improved. The laptop program, the school textbook program, the award of scholarships. Now, as soon as it's unfortunate that when another government comes into place, that happens in the Westminster system and even in the United States, that one set of policies is thrown through the window, and then you try to put in your own policies, but you fail to do so during the period of time.
Okay.
Now, they stopped the early childhood education program immediately. The performance of the primary school education program began to drop, where more than 50%, more than 13% of the students got less than 30%. The performance at the CSEC level fell. And where we had the best academic performance in 2014 in all 3 subject areas, CAPE, CSEC, and SEA, and we bettered it in 2015.
Okay.
As soon as the other government came in, everything began to drop. So they dropped the early childhood education. They stopped providing textbook. They stopped the laptop program. They stopped the school construction program. They stopped the homework centers. They stopped the continuous assessment component program. They went back for discussing at a national level the whole curriculum and so on, where we had implemented one of the best curriculums in the primary school education program. And we adopted Mr. Manning's curriculum when he departed office in 2010. So they went about it in a destructive manner. I'm sorry for having to say so. And they have not been able to catch up with it.
Right.
Why should you leave about 72 schools that were almost completed and they leave them to decay? I mean, because of spite, victimization, and hate and malice.
Okay, Dr. Gopi Singh, what I'm hearing as well is that apart from the university not being able to manage, this financial portfolio, internally, I'm also hearing that part of the problem has to do with the administration, the state, not being able to I suppose, treat with some of the issues as well. So that is it that burden of adjustment has to be shared or should have been shared in a way that we would have the kinds of successes that we would all want at the level of the university. Is it a sharing of
and education as a whole? I mean, Mr. Banning, Dr. Rowley had provided 2 ministers of education. Unfortunately, they seem never to have got along. And the whole education sector was left in a void to allow to decay over a period of time. And these 2 years, they have not done anything to bring it forward. Imagine you had over 100,000 students, children, sitting at home, not even able to get any IT system in place for them to receive their education for 2 years. You did not even provide books for them for the 5 years. And you reduce scholarships now from students from 500 scholarships, which we used to give, now to 50. And this is where they bring in the politicization of meritocracy. They have that word has been thrown out through the window. Meritocracy. There's no more like that. So you cut scholarships from 500 to 50. You're giving bursaries, and you remember the days of the PNM when they gave funding to their own political supporters, and even people within the People's National Movement were quarreling amongst themselves. Why would some get it and not get it?
But I know, again, Dr. Gopi Singh, I raised the point of this politicization of education, and maybe that's not a good thing for us, not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but in the region. And it brings me to a question whether you believe that in order to fix, this situation, would private sector, be an option, or should be an option? Let's say, just brutally frank, being, well, let's put education in the hands of the private sector. Is that a solution, or should it stay within the state purview and have it have a better management of it?
I would prefer the latter, which you discussed. The private sector has its own role. This is why a number of private institutions came on board, like School of Accounting and Management and SPCS, and a number of those providing, and Roytech and a few of those providing education. But they look to the state to subsidize their programs because the students who were in their program were citizens of Trinidad and Tobago who were looking to get some support from the government in moving forward. So the private sector has a role. But the government, under the ministers of education, must provide the disciplinary aspect of the programs and policies and the expenditure and so on in relation to both the private sector and the state sector.
All right, Dr. Gopi Singh, we have to take a break now. We would want to come back in a short while to continue the discussion on this very important subject. Whether or not there should be cuts in the budget. At the university level. We're talking UWI, University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and I'm speaking with former Education Minister Dr. Gopi Singh, Tim Gopi Singh. Dr. Gopi Singh, we're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we will continue the discussion.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much, Mr. Cummings.
The University of the West Indies has the capacity to generate its own funding, or at least part funding. Is that what I'm getting from you?
Yes, Stephen. Thank you very kindly. You to have put it in a precise language. If they have been doing that, it is to a minuscule extent.
Somebody tried to ask me, so what do you want? I said, brother, let me do good. Sometimes, even as a person, you ain't sure what you want, but you're absolutely sure what you don't want. And workers are absolutely certain that this 2% that is on offer is an insult.
2% over an 8-year period and tell your boy you're going through it, you know, things are hard. No. Are we living in a different Trinidad and Tobago? And that is what we have to discuss.
Discussion on health, leadership, governance, crime, education, and social justice. Every Wednesday, 8 to 9 p.m., the Citizens Community Forum. Your host, Stephen Cummings. And welcome back to the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings. At this time, we are talking education. Should there be cuts in the budgetary allocation going towards the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine? The national conversation has been just, around that. And of course, we've heard so many different comments and perspectives and views coming even from the Students' Guild. We heard the Minister of Finance, Con Ember, talking about, this burden. He stresses about this burden, this financial burden on the country, and whether or not, more should be given to the University of the West Indies, and whether, there should be a serious consideration for a 10% cut in their allocation. Dr. Gopi Singh, welcome back.
As you're on there, I want to re-emphasize that there should be no cut towards the expenditure at the university level on tertiary education.
All right.
The University of the West Indies must do a deep introspection and a financial analysis on the expenditure and try to reduce the expenditure as much as possible. The government also must not cut on the education sector, must try to give as much as possible that within the budgetary allocation to ensure that the education and the health sector are two areas. These are the cornerstone and fundamental pillars of any developed society. So health and education. And you want human capital development.
Yes,
you
indeed.
want people to be the best in the world, so that if people are unable to get employment in Trinidad, they can go elsewhere because of their qualification and skills and secure great employment.
All right.
The PhD levels is the other one which they cut as well. So I don't think the government should be cutting expenditure on education, but they should be meeting to discuss critical analysis of expenditure and see where institutions can reduce some of the expenditure to the benefit of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago.
Right. One of the recommendations to Dr. Gopi Singh, going from the government to the university, is that they needed to look at the type of courses that they offer, areas of study, and a direct question was put to the University of the West Indies via the finance minister. He's saying to the institution that, listen, tell us what are the programs you want us to pay for. And in a sense, he's actually telling the university there may be programs that are not needed at this time.
Well, that's a very critical issue. In terms, I was reading that there are over 305 programs or courses that are being.
So there may be top heavy. There may be top heavy, Dr. Gopi Singh.
Yeah, but they need to have an analysis of the areas that they're going to provide education, particularly for the national development of
and that's the point that I was getting at. You have to align your education system with the needs of the national development needs.
Thank you very kindly. And this is where the scholarship program came in. We, during our time, we decided that we will award scholarships at the tertiary education for the masters and the PhD based on the development needs of the country. And so when you determine where you want your people, you give your scholarships in line with that. But I want to say that the meritocracy has been thrown out of the window, Stephen. And I have great concerns of that. Reductions of scholarships, where there was meritocracy for 500 students getting scholarships, where you had the GATE program, those who did well could have gone on to do a PhD. Why have you stopped that? And the University of the West Indies and other institutions, why should not Roytech and CoStat and UTT? I don't know if you remember that, Stephen. that UTT was designed to assist in the technological development of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago in the allied fields to the oil sector.
Yes,
And
it was specifically set up for that during the time of the Manning administration. I know that there was a focus. Yes.
And there has been a wide deviation from that. Now, also the programs are being done at UTT when the core concept of University of Trinidad and Tobago was a technologically driven institution with partners internationally in the energy sector.
Right.
We could have been using that to train people from around the world where we can generate income from that.
But Dr. Gopi Singh, I'm also thinking, we're talking about the University of the West Indies, and I'm wondering, I have not been hearing, hearing anything that is similar, anything that is happening within UTT. Maybe there is something that is there that we are not familiar with, because if you're talking about having to fund the University of the West Indies and having problems there, could it be that we may be having similar problems at UTT? I don't know. I mean, it's a question that I'm putting out there to our listenership and our viewership. I don't have the answers.
They over 200 and something UTT personnel, some lecturers, some senior lecturers, were retrenched, and the country was not given an explanation of why this happened. It was flippant, and no conclusive evidential information was given as to why these lecturers and senior lecturers and so on were removed from their programs. But I come back to the fact that if we had continued UTT in the way that it was meant to be, as a engineering faculty, to developing persons trained in the technological aspect related to the oil industry and the energy sector, we could have been using all sort of programs now at UTT. And if you ask, probably UTT is just like UWI with 305 courses being offered, and you don't know the relevance of these courses.
And that's the question that I'm asking. Whether we may have another situation that is going to come eyeball us in the very near future.
Stephen, I did an executive master's in business administration. I believe I was the first medical doctor in the Caribbean to do an executive MBA, because I felt it was necessary, even us as doctors and as university professors and in academia. And I was clinical dean of the medical school for about 3 years, where I had over 1,500 medical students, vet students, dental students, pharmacy students under my wing. While the dean was at the head, I was a clinical dean. Now, where do we go in terms of management capabilities? Not because you're a good academic and you're a professor and you're head of the 5 faculties within UWI. What gives you the ability to manage properly? So there must be some training at a high level, even at UTT and UWI.
Okay.
And to have people who can determine management capacity and capabilities and do deep introspection on the whole policy formulation of the various institutions and the various faculties. So that is lacking. And this is one of the sad things we are lacking in Trinidad and Tobago, the inability to formulate programs and policies that are meant to be developmental. And we are not putting forward that because we don't have the management capacity and capability heading these aspects of national development. We pick up every fly-by-night person because you're politically aligned or politically. Get the best people to run these institutions. So even though you might be the best in engineering or the best in law, you must have the ability to be able to manage.
Okay.
You must train yourselves to manage. This is happening in the health sector now. It's happening in the education sector.
Well, I know we want to. I know we can have a separate program, Dr. Gopi Singh, to talk about health. But we want to stay. We want to stay on the business of education. And it's because it's a very important subject matter as well, and we just want to remind our listeners that this is the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings. I'm speaking with former Education Minister Dr. Tim Gopi Singh, and we are talking about education. Should there be cuts in the budgetary financial allocation going towards the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine? The government has been pressing the point that they should consider or look at a 10% cut in their expenditure. Dr. Gopi Singh, I wanted for the benefit of our listeners and our viewers as well to kind of just go back a bit on this GATE program and the origin of the GATE idea. Now, what we know and what is documented is that the GATE funding was made available to both undergraduate and postgraduate students, and it was based on a household income kind of system. Undergraduate students were able to access funding and in terms of, like, let's say for example 100% funding where household income was seen to be below that 10,000 per month mark. There was also a 75% funding where household income is seen as 10,000 per month, but less than 30,000. 50% funding where household income is seen as 30,000 per month and above. And then again, when we look at the postgraduate student, they would have been able to access 25% or 25 to 50% funding. And again, 50% funding where household income is less than 30,000 per month. So that there was a structure, Dr. Gopi Singh, that sort of informed as to how the system was supposed to have worked, who was supposed to have access and who were not supposed to probably have the kind of access. So that basically what you're saying in when we started in the first half of the program, what you're saying that all these systems just actually broke down. Is it that those systems just broke down along the way, Dr. Gopi Singh?
Well, I'll take you back. You remember under Mr. Pandey's administration, it was a dollar for dollar program.
Yeah, I remember that, yes.
So it started
a dollar was matched, yes, for whatever the student would have been able to pay.
It moved on. I think it was the brainchild of Mr. Pandey and his team at that time. You put a dollar and the state would put a dollar. It went on for a while. Then there was a movement towards improving that to some extent. But when we came into government in 2010, the whole question is like the laptop program. Because you're from a family that is a little better off than the poor child,
yes,
you must be deprived of a laptop because you might have your parents may have a little funding. That's not equity in education. That's not equity at all. Equity, high quality education is for all. So the PNM introduced the means test. And that what means test was a means. I don't
means states end. Some people say means states end, but go ahead.
Politicization of the education system, politicization, and when they decided that they're going to be 500 bursaries recently again, is another retrogressive step, politicizing the administration of meritocracy. So meritocracy has been thrown through the window, and politics has taken over, and that is the cult of what is happening across the board. And we, as you rightly said, there should be no politics, particularly in health and education. But when you begin to do that, now you reduce. Why should you continue the program to help a student moving from a master's program or a bachelor's to a PhD? You could imagine Trinidad and Tobago. Why did Singapore do so well?
Again, the development of their human capital, priority was placed on developing that aspect of the economy.
And Singapore has 10 major research institutions in the country. Major research institutions, 10 of them. And Trinidad and Tobago has how much research institutions? Development, national development. Tell me if you know anyone.
Well, it's difficult for me, Dr. Gopi Singh, to count on my finger. But that's another.
How are we going to develop the strength and the human capability and the capacity to move your country forward when you're in a quagmire of degradation and no movement forward in expanding the brain power of the country.
All right. You know,
I sat with 102 ministers of education in my second year as Minister of Education.
Well, I know that you would have been exposed to a lot in your time, Dr. Gopi Singh, and as an education.
We were marching along with the rest of the countries in the world, like Hong Kong, Singapore, Finland, South Korea, Japan. We were there alongside them in terms of what we were doing in education. And suddenly, as soon as we demitted office, there's a whole volte-face and a whole change in the approach to education, and everything went down the hill.
All right. Well, I know. I know. I know where you're going. Dr. Gopi Singh. Again, we want to sort of. Yes. But I know that I can feel your passion, Dr. Gopi Singh. I truly can feel your passion. But one of the things I'm also concerned about, and we can discuss it in the program. What is this really doing to the psyche of the younger person who aspiring to go to university, planning and thinking, well, maybe in the next few years I would get into medicine, I would get into, what do you think that this is doing, to the minds of persons, aspiring persons, for
it has smashed the whole psychological mindset. When a child entered primary school, secondary school, and they began to do the sciences, and they're looking at engineering or medicine or astrophysics or different aspects of chemistry, and for development of their capacity, and they look to getting scholarships because they come from poor, humble beginnings. And while they're in the education system, the government says, look, we're going to restructure and remodel the shaping of how many scholarships we're giving in a particular area. When I was Minister of Education, we had over 150 students getting A's and 1 modules in the sciences and mathematics. So one year I had to make a determination whether we cut off at 100 scholarships or we give the 150 who have achieved that level.
So you were placed. So Dr. Gopi Singh, you were placed with that same scenario of whether to cut.
But here, what they have cut it to 5. So 150 students excelling and getting the best grades, but you could only give 5 scholarships. And because you are spending the money in the areas that are wasteful and are not bringing any returns to the country. But where it could be given, you're not giving it.
All right. We just want to remind our listeners and our viewers that this is the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings. I'm speaking with Dr. Tim Gopi Singh, former Education Minister, and our topic this evening, whether or not there should be cuts in the budgetary financial allocations going towards the University of the West Indies. Dr. Gopi Singh, we have just a few minutes again before we close the program, and I wanted to address the issue of the medical school, the medical faculty. I've been, I'm aware that there was an issue very early with medical students, and I think this is probably one of the issues as well that's been talked about. Medical students who would have gotten, let's say, scholarships and what have you, and then there was a plan, there was a system in place to have medical students once they graduated and what have you, to give back to the country, to the economy. Again, that revolving system. What do you know? What has happened to that program as far as you know?
Well, first of all, those students who benefited from the state by scholarships, when they came out after graduating in the final year and finishing their internship, they were unable to get positions in the government service. They are willing to serve, but every year another 100 was added on to the listing of those who are desirous of serving. And at one time, there were more than 300 young doctors staying at home.
300 doctors, Dr. Gopi Singh?
Yes, there were.
Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, and there some of them were serving in gas stations. Some of them went into agriculture. Some didn't know what to do with themselves because they want to continue. And the minister said that he didn't have jobs for them. And then he said, hold on, he said that they were not willing to come forward and work in rural areas when that was a total untruth. And so 300 young doctors having scholarships, willing to serve the country, did not get employment. They only got employment when the pandemic came on, and they said, well, now we have jobs for you. And of course, all these young ones want to learn their profession and serve in their profession. They came forward and they began to serve the people of Trinidad and Tobago. So the big hoorah, here it is, we have doctors. And the same thing they did with nursing staff. There were over 1,500 nurses waiting to be employed, and they were not getting jobs. So you give the scholarship, the students are trained, they're ready to give back to the country, they're not given the opportunity. So you can understand the dismay and lack of appreciation of what was really happening in this country. And it's at a bounce today, dismal failures in the whole administration of the health sector.
All right. Well, I know there has been a call as well for an audit, Dr. Gobi Singh, as to what has happened, but I don't want to go into that.
Yeah, let me make this point. I will tell you, those 3,000 people who died needlessly, many of those, hundreds of those who died needlessly, I will tell you.
Okay, well, Dr. Gobi Singh, let's leave that for another program. We can probably focus on that at another program. But I just wanted us to stay on this business of the cuts for University of Education. We have just, as a matter of fact, we have just a few minutes, and maybe I can use this opportunity to have you give us some wrap up comments and some views as we close the program on this very same topic of whether or not we should be cutting. Well, you did say that there'll be no cuts. You're saying that there should be no cuts in budgetary allocation. But what else can we do, Dr. Gopi Singh, to help, apart from what you have said already? What else can we do to help ease this situation here that we continue to experience here in Trinidad and Tobago with respect to education?
The Prime Minister of this country, I will appoint a task force to bring me some recommendations within a short period of about 6 weeks, and in the first instance, and probably a 3-month period, to determine how much money you're giving to these institutions, what courses they are offering, how is it improving the national development, see the role of the private sector, how can we generate more funding from an international education program where we bring students from abroad to do their programs. In the United States, it costs about $60,000 US per year to go into a degree program. You don't think that some of them will want to come with now digital education. So bring in more philanthropy, invite more money from the, international organizations for research and development, and work with international partners to bring in education bring in funding from abroad for education programs, and also improving the health sector programs. We're bringing foreign universities to generate more funding, because a significant part of that 600 million and the GATE program goes towards medical students' expenses. Don't cut it, because the students will suffer, but do an analysis and do it very quickly and find out where you can help a lot more, rather than cutting the program, and you don't know why you're cutting it because you want to cut it. And this is the hallmark of Minister Imbert. I'm sorry to say, he does not do a proper analysis of things before he makes a decision.
Okay, well, maybe
a University Senate that meets, and I hope that the Senate of the University of the West Indies will meet on this matter and have an urgent discussion on the way forward on this. Don't cut the funding for the university, because the students will suffer and education will continue to be on a decline.
All right, Dr. Gopi Singh, we have to leave it there at the moment. We are all out of time, and of course, as per usual, we want to thank you for being on the Citizens Community Forum. We have to continue this discussion. When we talk about education, it's that pillar. When we talk about national development, when we talk about the development of the human capital, so we can't not discuss education, in this vein. So again, we just want to thank you for being on the program once again, and we will take the opportunity certainly to invite you back at another time. Thank you so much, Dr. Gopi Singh.
It's a privilege and a pleasure, and thank you for asking me, and thank you very much to the listening audience and the viewing audience. It's a privilege and a pleasure.
Thank you. This is the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings, talking there with Dr. Tim Gopi Singh, former Education Minister, and of course our subject matter reactions to university education budget cuts, whether or not there should be a cut in expenditure, and that has formed the national conversation here in Trinidad and Tobago. Well, that's all the time we have at the moment on the program. I'm Stephen Cummings. See you next Wednesday for another program. It was a famous poet who once said, "They came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Words there from famous poet Martin Niemöller, 1892 to 1984.